In the cold December of 1940, the British Empire, the crown jewel of the modern world, stood battered but unbroken. On the map, it stretched across continents, a splash of pink covering Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But inside the war rooms of Whitehall, a different story was being written. The empire was not just under attack from bombs and bullets, it was bleeding financially, dangerously, and in secret. Winston Churchill, the prime minister, whose voice had become the rallying cry of free nations, sat hunched in the underground cabinet war rooms. Before him lay a letter that would change the course of the war and the fate of the British Empire. He was writing to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. And he had to admit something almost unthinkable. Britain, the richest and most powerful nation of the 19th century, the workshop of the world, the empire that had defeated Napoleon, was utterly bankrupt. This was not mere exaggeration. Britain had spent the first year of the war draining its reserves. Billions in gold had been shipped across the Atlantic to Canada in a secret operation called Operation Fish. Battleships and fastliners carried the wealth of the empire in gold bars and securities to protect it from German U-boats. The treasury was empty. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington held contracts it could not pay for. Factories in Coventry and Liverpool churned under the Blitz. Yet without funds, no weapons could arrive. Churchill's letter was a plea, a confession, and a negotiation all in one. He described the devastation, the German U-boats controlling the Atlantic, the constant bombings, the impossible financial strain. And he asked Roosevelt for help. Not as an ally, but as a debtor, a client, a nation on its knees. To understand how this happened, we need to see the mechanics of total war economics. At the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Britain was still a global financial titan. Billions in gold reserves, overseas investments in railroads, 9 mines and factories, and a dominant position in global shipping and insurance. Britain had it all. But Hitler's war was unlike any that had come before. This was a war of machines. It consumed steel, aluminum, oil, and rubber at rates that no pre-war economist could calculate. And crucially, Britain could not produce many of these materials itself. Imports were essential, and the blockade of continental Europe meant the empire had to turn its gaze west to the United States. But America was neutral, isolationist. The memory of the First World War hung heavily on Congress and the public alike. Neutrality acts had been passed, including the infamous cash and carry clause. Belligerent nations like Britain could buy weapons from American factories, but only if they paid immediately in cash and transported them themselves. No loans, no credit, only gold on the barrelhead. For the first year of the war, Britain drained its treasury to meet these demands. Gold flowed into New York, bills were paid, lives were saved. But by late 1940, the cash had dried up. The empire had spent its inheritance to keep its head above water. Roosevelt understood the stakes. If Britain fell, America would be next. But he also faced a dilemma. He could not simply give away American money. Public opinion would explode. The law forbade it. The solution was ingenious and ruthless. Lend-Lease. Roosevelt framed it as neighborly generosity. Imagine your neighbor's house is on fire, he said. You don't haggle over the price of a hose. You lend it. You save the house. And the hose comes back when the fire is out. On the surface, it sounded simple, almost noble. But behind closed doors, the negotiations were brutal. The American Treasury, led by Henry Morgenthau Jr., demanded Britain strip itself bare first. Every asset, every overseas holding, every investment. Britain's negotiators were stunned. They were treated not as a sovereign ally, but as a bankrupt client in receivership. The British Empire, once a global creditor, was now being audited down to its last shell casing and every woolen sock. One particularly painful example was the American Viscose Corporation, the profitable industrial giant owned by British interests, generating millions of dollars annually. Morgenthau identified it immediately as a source of cash. He demanded Britain sell it to pay for the weapons already being ordered from the United States. Britain resisted. Selling it in the middle of a war would be financial suicide. The company was worth $100 million, but Britain was forced to accept a distress sale for roughly $54 million. The sale was not charity. It was a stark lesson. The empire was losing its wealth faster than it could fight the war. Every asset stripped, every dollar spent, was a reminder of Britain's dependence. The liquidation extended beyond factories. Britain's strategic assets, its geopolitical positions, were now on the negotiating table. Desperate for destroyers, Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 aging ships. The deal? In exchange, the U.S. would receive 99-year leases on naval and air bases across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, Jamaica to Trinidad. Britain had traded centuries of strategic influence for a few dozen rusting vessels. The empire's survival came at the cost of its long-term autonomy. By March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act passed. Britain was alive, yes, but stripped bare. Gold reserves gone. Investments sold, strategic bases leased, financial independence obliterated. The empire had fought and survived, but the price was monumental. It was a moral victory. Yes, but economically, Britain had mortgaged its future to America. Even as the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the imbalance only grew. American industry, untouched by war, expanded exponentially. Factories churned out planes, tanks, cars, and radios for global markets. Britain's industry, exhausted and cannibalized for war, could not compete. While British factories produced Spitfires, American factories produced both Spitfires and refrigerators for the world market. Britain was still fighting, but the US was quietly winning the economic war. By 1944, the shift was clear. Two-thirds of the world's gold was in American vaults. The financial center of gravity had moved across the Atlantic. Britain had saved itself militarily, but economically, it was a shell of its former self, and the true cost of the war would only be revealed after victory. Britain expected Lend-Lease to continue for reconstruction, but America was preparing to flip the switch. The empire, which had sold every asset it could to survive, would face the harshest reality of all. The guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945. Victory in Europe was declared. Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, or in Roosevelt's absence, Harry Truman convened to shape the post-war world. On the surface, Britain had survived the Blitz, outlasted Hitler, and preserved the Allied cause. Yet beneath the medals, speeches, and parades, the empire faced a harsher reality. Financially, it was exhausted. Economically, it was dependent. Strategically, it had ceded power to the United States, and the decisions made in desperation during the darkest days of 1940-41 were now coming home to roost. During the war, Britain had mortgaged nearly everything to secure immediate survival. Gold reserves shipped to Canada, investments sold at fire sale prices, strategic bases leased to America. These were not temporary sacrifices. They had reshaped the empire's economic map forever. Lend-Lease, while framed as a temporary measure, had created dependency. Supplies continued, but they came with implicit obligations. Britain was a debtor nation, and the creditor was the United States. The first post-war shock came in 1945-46, when Britain faced the enormous cost of reconstruction. Cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool had been flattened. Infrastructure, factories, and housing were in ruins. Unlike the United States, whose factories had not been bombed, Britain could not simply pivot back to peacetime production without vast imports of raw materials and capital. But America had its own priorities. Truman, inheriting Roosevelt's mantle, faced domestic pressures. Lend-Lease, once a tool of wartime survival, was not intended to subsidize post-war reconstruction indefinitely. The narrative of neighborly generosity had limits. Loans had to be repaid, assets liquidated, and economic influence maintained. Britain turned to the treasury. Its options were bleak. The empire had no gold to draw on. Overseas investments had been sold. Trade tariffs had been dismantled under the pressure of wartime agreements with the United States. The British government faced a choice: impose austerity or surrender influence. Austerity became the default. Rationing, which had been a wartime necessity, stretched into the late 1940s and early 1950s. Clothing, sugar, meat, and even coal remained strictly controlled. Citizens who had endured the Blitz now faced scarcity in peacetime. The government borrowed heavily, both domestically and from international institutions, but the debt grew faster than the economy could recover. Behind the public face of ration books and austerity, Britain's industrial sectors struggled to regain footing. Factories had been converted for wartime production. Raw materials like steel and aluminum were still tightly rationed. Meanwhile, American manufacturers, untouched by bombing and armed with vast wartime profits, flooded global markets with consumer goods. Britain, despite decades of industrial dominance, found itself unable to compete. This was the hidden cost of protecting American interests during the war. The empire had survived militarily, but economically, it had been reshaped to serve a new power. Britain had kept Hitler at bay, but in doing so, it had also preserved the United States' economic ascendancy. By 1946, the British government formally requested a post-war loan from the United States. The negotiations were tense. Britain, desperate to avoid default, proposed terms it believed reasonable. The Americans, however, insisted on repayment in dollars, interest on the loans, and continued access to strategic commodities. Britain's autonomy and trade policy had been severely restricted. Every agreement further cemented the empire's economic subordination. The loan, totaling £3.75 billion, an astronomical sum at the time, came with strings attached. British policymakers now realized the empire had become, for the first time in its history, a dependent power. The United States dictated the terms, controlled access to essential materials, and effectively oversaw Britain's recovery strategy. While Britain had fought to preserve democracy and sovereignty, it had also ensured that its empire would no longer dictate global economic affairs. These financial entanglements had lasting consequences on the empire's colonies. India, the jewel of the British crown, was heavily indebted to London, yet London itself was dependent on Washington. To maintain revenue, the government imposed new taxes, delayed investment, and tightened control over colonial economies. Paradoxically, the empire was now weaker at the center. while colonies were expected to support a war-depleted Britain. This financial strain accelerated the process of decolonization. By the late 1940s, Britain faced unrest in India, strikes in Africa, and nationalist movements across Asia. Economic dependence on the United States meant that Britain could no longer sustain the administrative and military costs of empire. The bankruptcy incurred to protect American interests had indirectly hastened the empire's dissolution. Meanwhile, on the world stage, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. New York replaced London as the financial capital of the world. American banks held the key to global reconstruction, lending to governments, dictating trade terms, and shaping industrial recovery. Britain's military achievements in World War II could not compensate for this economic subordination. By the 1950s, Britain's public infrastructure, industry, and standard of living lagged behind American prosperity. Citizens who had endured the war now faced peacetime austerity. Meanwhile, the United States experienced a post-war boom, its factories churning out consumer goods, automobiles, and durable household items at unprecedented scale. The disparity was stark and deeply tied to wartime financial decisions. Historians often argue about the reasons Britain accepted such dependency. Patriotism, the urgency of wartime survival, and the need to protect European civilization were undoubtedly factors. Yet at its core, the empire had made a strategic choice to protect American interests in the short term. It mortgaged its own long-term economic sovereignty. Every pound spent, every factory sold, every naval base leased reinforced a dependency that would last decades. The human cost was equally profound. Soldiers returned from war to a nation that had saved Europe, but had little to offer its citizens. Food, fuel, and housing remained scarce. Economic opportunities were limited. Britain had preserved its empire on paper, but the people who had defended it faced hardship. Meanwhile, the United States reaped both moral credit and economic advantage. It had entered the war late, suffered fewer casualties, and emerged as the preeminent global superpower. Britain's financial collapse during World War II illustrates a broader lesson in geopolitics. Military survival does not guarantee economic sovereignty. The nation can fight bravely, win battles, and protect allies, but if it spends its wealth to sustain others, its own long-term power can erode. For Britain, the price of protecting American interests was more than gold or credit. It was global influence, economic autonomy, and imperial prestige. Yet there were lessons and strategic calculations that shaped future policy. Britain pivoted to new institutions, creating frameworks like the International Monetary Fund and participating in the Bretton Woods system, seeking to regain a voice in global finance. But the era of unchallenged British financial dominance had ended. The empire that had once ruled the seas and markets was now a partner, under American supervision, dependent on Washington's goodwill for reconstruction and survival. The British experience also reshaped American foreign policy. Lend-Lease demonstrated the power of economic leverage as a tool of war and influence. The United States realized that financial power could achieve what armies alone could not, restructuring global order, dictating trade, and shaping post-war policy without occupying territory. Britain's financial collapse became a blueprint for 20th century geopolitics, using aid and credit to secure strategic interests. By 1950, the story was clear. Britain had survived the existential threat of Nazism, preserved democracy in Europe, and maintained its empire in the short term. But economically, the empire was a shadow of its former self. Its gold reserves were gone, its overseas investments liquidated, strategic bases under American lease, its currency replaced as the global standard, its industrial base diminished, and its political power tied to the fortunes of a new superpower across the Atlantic. The British Empire had been bankrupted to protect American interests, not out of malice or miscalculation, but out of necessity. Churchill and his cabinet understood the choice to fight and risk economic ruin, or surrender financial autonomy to survive militarily. They chose survival, and in doing so, shaped the post-war world. This story is not merely about numbers, debt, or gold. It is about the intersection of economics and war, about decisions made under pressure that ripple across generations. It is about an empire that gave its all to fight tyranny, only to discover that the cost of victory included a fundamental transformation of its global role. And so the British Empire, once the unrivaled ruler of global finance and territory, entered the second half of the 20th century, humbled, indebted, and dependent alive militarily, but forever altered economically. Its survival in the war had ensured American security, American prosperity, and American influence. In protecting American interests, Britain had preserved its people, its armies, and its immediate power, but at the cost of its financial independence, global influence, and ultimately, the empire itself. The lesson is clear. Military victory alone cannot secure lasting sovereignty. Wealth, assets, and strategic autonomy are as critical as soldiers, ships, and planes. The British Empire's wartime bankruptcy shows how intertwined economics and geopolitics truly are, and how the decisions of a desperate nation can shape the world for decades to come. The empire had fought, it had survived, and it had won the war. But the ledger told a different story, a story of debt, loss, and a strategic transfer of power that would define the modern world order.